The stagecoach rattled into Wallace, Idaho on a blistering August afternoon in 1883, and Katherine Preston talked through every mile of dust and heat, her words spilling out like water from a broken dam while the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She could not help herself, never could, this tendency to fill every silence with observations about the landscape, questions about their destination, stories from her childhood in Boston, musings about the weather, and apologies that only led to more talking. By the time the horses pulled to a stop outside the Wallace Hotel, the elderly woman beside her looked ready to throw herself from the moving vehicle, and Katherine felt that familiar burning shame creeping up her neck. "I am so sorry," Katherine said to no one in particular as she gathered her carpetbag and stepped down into the dusty street. "I know I talk too much. My mother always said I could talk the ears off a mule. I just get nervous when I travel, and when I am nervous, I cannot seem to stop the words from coming out. And then I worry that I am bothering people, which makes me more nervous, which makes me talk more. And it becomes this terrible cycle that I cannot break, and oh goodness, I am doing it again, are not I?" The other passengers hurried away without answering, and Katherine stood alone on the wooden sidewalk, clutching her bag and feeling the weight of her own foolishness. She had come to Wallace to take a position as a schoolteacher, leaving behind her family and everything familiar, because Boston had grown too small, too suffocating, too full of people who knew her as that chattering Preston girl who could not hold her tongue. She had promised herself that Idaho would be different, that she would learn to be quiet and reserved like a proper lady, that she would think before speaking and count to 10 before opening her mouth. That resolution had lasted approximately 4 hours into her journey west. Katherine walked toward the hotel, her practical brown traveling dress already covered in a fine layer of dust, her dark hair escaping from its pins despite her best efforts that morning. Wallace was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings pressed between steep mountains, the evidence of silver mining visible in the scarred hillsides, and the constant sound of industry echoing through the valley. Men in work clothes moved along the streets, eyeing her with curiosity, and she felt suddenly very far from home. The hotel clerk was a thin man with a mustache that drooped past his chin, and he looked at Katherine with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many hopeful souls arrive in Wallace with dreams that would not survive the harsh Idaho winter. She signed the register with trembling hands, her chattiness temporarily suppressed by exhaustion and the reality of what she had done. She had actually left Boston. She had actually traveled 2,000 miles to teach school in a mining town where she knew absolutely no one. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the main street. Katherine set down her bag and sat on the edge of the mattress, suddenly overwhelmed by the silence. In Boston, there had always been noise, her 3 sisters talking and laughing, her mother calling instructions from the kitchen, the sounds of the city filtering through the windows. Here, there was only the distant sound of mining equipment and the occasional voice from the street below. She lasted approximately 10 minutes before the silence became unbearable, and she decided to explore the town. The school where she would teach did not open for another 3 weeks, and she needed to learn her way around, needed to find the general store and the church and all the other landmarks that would make Wallace feel less foreign. She changed into a fresh dress, repinned her hair, and stepped back out into the August heat. The main street of Wallace ran parallel to the river, which was running low in the late summer heat, exposing smooth stones along its banks. Katherine walked slowly, taking in the assortment of businesses. A general store, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a restaurant, a barber, and various other establishments that served the mining community. She passed groups of men who tipped their hats politely, and she smiled and nodded, biting her tongue to keep from launching into conversation with complete strangers. She found the schoolhouse at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and windows that needed washing. The door was unlocked, and Katherine stepped inside to find a single room with rows of desks, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a blackboard that had seen better days. This would be her domain, her purpose, her reason for being in Idaho. She ran her hand over the teacher's desk and felt a flutter of excitement mixed with terror. "You the new teacher?" Katherine jumped and spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the bright sunlight outside. She was perhaps 40 years old, wearing a simple calico dress and an apron, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. The woman's stern expression softened into something that might have been amusement. "I am Margaret Foster. My husband owns the general store. I help coordinate things for the school board. It is wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Foster. I am very grateful for this opportunity, truly I am. I promise I will work very hard and do my absolute best with the children." Margaret Foster studied her for a long moment, and Katherine felt her cheeks burning. There she went again, talking and talking and talking when she should have simply introduced herself and kept quiet. "You do talk a lot," Mrs. Foster said, but her tone was not unkind. "The children will either love you or run circles around you. Time will tell which." "I know I talk too much," Katherine said, the words coming out in a rush of apology. Mrs. Foster actually smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Come by the store tomorrow morning. I will introduce you to some of the other women in town. You will need friends here, Miss Preston. Wallace can be lonely for newcomers, especially women." Katherine thanked her profusely, with far too many words, and Mrs. Foster left shaking her head. Katherine remained in the schoolhouse for a while longer, alternating between excitement and mortification. She had been in Wallace for less than 3 hours and had already established herself as the woman who could not stop talking. The next morning, true to her word, Mrs. Foster introduced Katherine to several of the townswomen, including the doctor's wife, the pastor's wife, and a widow who ran a boarding house. They were polite but reserved, clearly taking the measure of this talkative Easterner who had come to teach their children. Katherine tried desperately to monitor her words, to speak only when spoken to give short, sensible answers to their questions. She lasted approximately 20 minutes before launching into a detailed story about her journey west that included every stop, every meal, every interesting passenger, and every thought that had crossed her mind during the long days of travel. The women listened with varying degrees of patience, and when Katherine finally wound down, there was a moment of silence that felt like judgment. She excused herself quickly, claiming she needed to unpack her belongings, and hurried back to the hotel with tears prickling her eyes. She was never going to fit in here. She was never going to be the quiet, dignified schoolteacher these people expected. She was always going to be too much, too loud, too chattering. She spent the rest of that day and the next mostly in her room, venturing out only for meals and brief walks. She wrote long letters to her family, filling page after page with her observations and worries and hopes, all the words she was trying not to speak aloud. She read the books she had brought with her, trying to lose herself in stories of other places and other people. She planned lessons for her future students, imagining a classroom full of eager young faces hanging on her every word. On her 4th day in Wallace, Katherine decided she needed to venture farther from town. The walls of her hotel room were closing in, and the mountains surrounding the valley called to her with promises of solitude and space. She asked the hotel clerk about safe places to walk, and he directed her to a trail that followed the river upstream, away from the mining operations and into the forest. The trail was easy to follow, a well-worn path that hugged the riverbank and wound through stands of pine and fir. Katherine walked slowly, breathing in the clean mountain air and listening to the sound of water rushing over stones. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, she felt her mind begin to quiet. There was something about being alone in nature that made her chattiness subside, as though the trees and the river provided enough companionship that she did not need to fill the silence with her own voice. She walked for over an hour, climbing gradually as the trail led deeper into the mountains. The river narrowed and grew more turbulent, and the forest grew thicker, blocking out much of the afternoon sun. She was just beginning to think she should turn back when she rounded a bend and saw a cabin. It was small and rough, built from logs with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Smoke curled from the chimney, indicating someone was home, and as Katherine stood there debating whether to continue on or turn back, the door opened. The man who emerged was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that had not seen a razor in quite some time. He wore work clothes, faded and patched, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He stopped when he saw Katherine, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip where a gun belt hung, and they stared at each other for a long moment. "I am so sorry," Katherine blurted out, the words tumbling over themselves in her haste to explain. "I did not mean to intrude." The man said nothing. He simply stood there, watching her with eyes that were a startling shade of blue against his tanned skin. His silence was so complete, so absolute that it made Katherine even more nervous, and when she was nervous, she talked more. "I am Katherine Preston," she continued, taking a step backward down the trail. "I am the new schoolteacher in Wallace, or I will be when school starts in a few weeks, and I was just taking a walk because I have been cooped up in my hotel room for days, and I needed some fresh air and some space to think, and I promise I was not snooping or anything like that. I was simply walking on what I thought was a public trail, and I truly did not mean any harm, and I will be going now, immediately, right away. I will not bother you any further." She turned to leave, but the man spoke, and his voice was so unexpected after his long silence that she froze. "Trail is public." Katherine turned back to face him, relief flooding through her. The faintest hint of something that might have been amusement crossed the man's face, though it was gone so quickly Katherine was not sure she had actually seen it. He leaned against the porch railing, crossing his arms over his chest, and continued to watch her with those unsettling blue eyes. "I am sorry," Katherine said again, feeling her cheeks burn. "I talk too much." The man tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might study an unusual bird that had landed on the porch. He still said nothing, and his silence stretched on so long that Katherine felt compelled to fill it. "You live out here all alone?" she asked, then immediately wished she had not. It was none of her business, and it was probably rude to ask. "I am sorry, that was prying. I should not have asked that. It is just that it seems very isolated, which is probably why you chose to live here, to get away from people. And here I am talking your ear off, which is exactly what you were trying to avoid by living in the middle of the forest. And I truly am sorry. I will stop talking now. I will close my mouth and not say another word, I promise." To her complete surprise, the man's mouth curved into a small smile. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, less forbidding. He pushed off from the porch railing and walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he did not want to startle her. When he was a few feet away, he stopped and spoke again, his voice low and rough, as though he did not use it often. "Yates Zimmerman." "I have been silent for years. Keep talking." Katherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I am sorry, what?" "I said keep talking," Yates repeated, and this time his smile was wider, genuine. "I like listening." "You like listening?" Katherine repeated incredulously. "To me?" "To my rambling and chattering and going on about nothing in particular?" "Yes." It was the simplest answer, the most straightforward response, and Katherine felt something shift in her chest. She had spent her entire life being told to be quiet, to think before speaking, to give others a chance to talk. She had been shushed and hushed and told that her constant chatter was unladylike, exhausting, overwhelming. And here was this silent cowboy, this solitary man living alone in the mountains, telling her to keep talking. "I do not understand," she said softly. "Why would you want to listen to me?" Yates was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were careful, chosen with deliberation. "Been alone a long time. Forgot what it sounds like to hear someone happy." "I am not particularly happy," Katherine said, surprised into honesty. "I am nervous and uncertain and worried that I have made a terrible mistake coming here." "But you talk like someone who finds wonder in things," Yates said. "Like the world still surprises you. I forgot what that is like." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back quickly. "That is possibly the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me." Yates gestured toward the cabin. "Coffee." "Oh, I should not impose," Katherine said automatically, even as part of her desperately wanted to accept. "You did not invite company, and I have already taken up too much of your time. And I am sure you have things to do, and I really should be getting back to town before it gets too late. Though it is still early afternoon, so I suppose I have time. But I do not want to be a burden, and I truly have already talked your ear off. Though you said you wanted me to keep talking, which is still very confusing to me, but I appreciate the offer, I truly do." "That a yes?" Yates asked, and there was definite amusement in his voice now. Katherine laughed despite herself. "Yes. Yes, that is a yes. I would love some coffee. Thank you." She followed him into the cabin, which was dim and cool after the brightness outside. It was a single room, sparsely furnished with a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a stove and shelves lined with supplies. It was meticulously clean, everything in its place, and Katherine had the impression of a man who had learned to live alone and had organized his life accordingly. Yates poured coffee from a pot on the stove into 2 tin cups and handed one to Katherine. She wrapped her hands around it, grateful for something to hold, and perched on one of the chairs while Yates leaned against the wall watching her. "So," Katherine said, then stopped, unsure where to begin. There were 1,000 questions tumbling through her mind, but she did not want to pry, did not want to overstep. "How long have you lived out here?" 5 years, Yates said, "give or take." "That is a long time to be alone," Katherine said softly. "Do you ever go into town?" "Sometimes." "For supplies?" "Not often." "And you just stay out here by yourself day after day?" Katherine tried to imagine it and could not. She would go mad within a week without anyone to talk to. "What do you do all day?" "Trap, hunt, fish, chop wood, think." "That sounds very peaceful," Katherine said, and meant it, even though she knew such a life would never suit her. "I think I would like the peace, but I would miss the conversation. I would miss having someone to share things with, all the small observations and thoughts that fill up my head and need somewhere to go. That is why I talk so much, I think. My thoughts overflow, and they have to come out somehow, and talking is the only way I know how." Yates took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why did you come to Idaho?" It was Catherine's turn to be thoughtful, to consider her words before speaking. "I needed a fresh start. Boston was becoming suffocating. Everyone there knew me as that chattering Preston girl, and I wanted to go somewhere where I could be more than that, where I could be the school teacher, the woman who educates children and makes a difference. But I am beginning to think I brought my problems with me. I have only been in Wallace a few days, and already people look at me like I am too much." "You are not too much," Yates said quietly. "You are exactly right." Katherine felt her throat tighten. "You do not know me well enough to say that. I know enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Katherine marveled at how easy it felt. With most people, silence made her anxious, made her feel compelled to fill the space with words. But with Yates, the silence felt natural, a counterbalance to her own need to talk. He seemed perfectly content to simply be, to exist in the moment without needing to explain or justify or narrate. "Tell me about Boston," Yates said eventually. "What was it like?" And so Katherine talked. She told him about her childhood home, a narrow brownstone in a crowded neighborhood. She told him about her 3 sisters, all younger and all more quiet and proper than she was. She told him about her parents, her father who worked as a clerk and her mother who ran the household with military precision. She told him about the schools where she had taught before, about the children she had loved and the satisfaction of watching them learn. She told him about the moment she had seen the advertisement for a schoolteacher in Wallace, Idaho, and how something in her heart had leaped at the possibility of adventure, of escape, of starting over. Yates listened without interrupting, his eyes attentive, his body language open. He nodded occasionally, made small sounds of acknowledgement, but mostly he just let her talk. And Katherine found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, fears and hopes and dreams that she had kept locked inside because they felt too vulnerable to share. The afternoon slipped into evening, and Katherine realized with a start that she had been in the cabin for hours. "Oh goodness, I need to get back to town," she said, jumping up from her chair. "It will be dark soon, and I do not know the trail well enough to walk it in the dark, and people will worry. Well, probably no one will actually worry because no one in Wallace knows me well enough to worry. But I should get back regardless, and I have taken up your entire afternoon. I am so sorry. I did not mean to stay so long." "I will walk you back," Yates said, setting down his cup. "Trail can be tricky in low light." "You do not have to do that," Katherine protested, even as relief flooded through her at the offer. "I can manage on my own." "I know you can," Yates said, "but I want to." They walked back to Wallace as the sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Katherine talked less on the return journey, partly because she was paying attention to the trail and partly because she felt talked out, emptied of words for perhaps the first time in her life. Yates walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, and when they reached the edge of town, he stopped. "Will you come back?" he asked. "To the cabin." Katherine looked at him, at his serious face and hopeful eyes, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Yes," she said. "If you want me to, I want you to." "Then I will. Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Yates agreed. Katherine walked back to the hotel feeling lighter than she had in days, and when she lay in bed that night, she did not feel lonely. Instead, she felt anticipation, excitement, the beginning of something she could not quite name. She returned to the cabin the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and the afternoon after that. It became a routine, a rhythm to her days. She would spend her mornings in town, shopping or visiting with the other women or preparing the schoolhouse. And then she would walk the trail to Yates's cabin, where he would make coffee and listen to her talk. She learned about him slowly, in small pieces that he offered carefully, as though he was out of practice sharing himself with another person. He had been a ranch hand once, working on a spread in Montana. There had been an accident, something he did not want to talk about in detail, and afterward he had not been able to bear being around people. He had come to Idaho seeking solitude, seeking a way to live with the noise in his own head by eliminating all external noise. He had been alone for 5 years, speaking to people only when absolutely necessary, and he had thought he would spend the rest of his life that way. "What changed?" Katherine asked one afternoon as they sat on his porch watching the river. "You," Yates said simply. "You came walking up the trail talking a mile a minute, and I realized how much I had missed hearing another person's voice, how much I had missed feeling connected to something outside myself." "I am glad I wandered up here," Katherine said softly. "I am glad I found you." "I am glad you found me too," Yates replied. And when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. As the days passed and their friendship deepened, Katherine found herself thinking about Yates constantly. She would be in town conducting some mundane errand, and something would happen that made her think, "I must tell Yates about this." She would lie in bed at night replaying their conversations, remembering the way he listened so intently, the way his rare smiles transformed his face, the way he looked at her as though she was something precious. The other women in Wallace began to notice her daily walks into the forest, and Mrs. Foster pulled her aside one morning with a concerned expression. "Where do you go every afternoon, Miss Preston? It is not safe for a woman to wander alone in the mountains." "I am not alone," Katherine said before she could think better of it. "I have been visiting a friend who lives up the trail." "A friend?" Mrs. Foster's eyebrows rose. "Who?" "Yates Zimmerman. He has a cabin about an hour upstream." Recognition flashed across Mrs. Foster's face, followed by concern. "The hermit? Miss Preston, that man has not spoken to more than 2 people in the entire time he has lived here. He is not right in the head, people say. You should not be visiting him alone." "He is not a hermit," Katherine said, feeling defensive. "He is a kind man who prefers solitude, and he has been nothing but respectful toward me. I enjoy his company." Mrs. Foster looked skeptical but did not push further, and Katherine continued her daily visits to the cabin. She told herself they were just friends, that she enjoyed Yates's company because he was the only person in Wallace who seemed to appreciate her talkativeness rather than merely tolerate it. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was falling in love with the quiet cowboy who lived alone in the mountains, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. School began in early September, and Katherine threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm. She had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were exactly as Mrs. Foster had predicted, alternately charmed by and overwhelmed by their chatty new teacher. Katherine loved every minute of it. She loved planning lessons and watching understanding dawn on young faces. She loved reading aloud and seeing her students get lost in stories. She loved the challenge of managing different ages and abilities in one room, the puzzle of how to keep everyone engaged and learning. But as much as she loved teaching, she lived for the afternoons when she could close the schoolhouse door and walk up the mountain trail to Yates's cabin. He always seemed to be listening for her approach, and he would emerge onto the porch before she even arrived, coffee already brewing on the stove. One crisp October afternoon, Katherine arrived at the cabin to find Yates outside splitting wood. His shirt sleeves were rolled up despite the cool air, and she watched the play of muscles in his forearms as he swung the axe. When he saw her, he set down the axe and smiled, and Katherine felt her heart do a small flip in her chest. "You are going to freeze out here without a jacket," she said, walking toward him. The temperature has dropped at least 10 degrees since yesterday. And I know you mountain men pride yourselves on being tough and not feeling the cold, but that does not mean you should risk catching a chill, especially this time of year when winter is coming and you need to stay healthy. And I know I sound like someone's mother right now, but I worry about you being out here all alone with no one to take care of you if you get sick. Yates caught her hand as she reached him, his fingers rough and warm around hers. Katherine. She stopped talking, startled by the touch and the intensity in his voice. Yes, I am falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Katherine stared at him, her mouth open, every thought fleeing from her head except for the pounding awareness that Yates Zimmerman had just said he was falling in love with her. I know I should not have said anything, Yates continued, his thumb rubbing small circles on the back of her hand. You are a respectable schoolteacher, and I am a man who lives alone in the woods like some kind of wild animal. I have nothing to offer you except a rough cabin and a quiet life, but I needed you to know. I needed to be honest about how I feel. You think you have nothing to offer me? Katherine said, finding her voice at last. Yates, you have given me more in these past few weeks than anyone has given me in my entire life. You have made me feel heard and valued and appreciated for exactly who I am. You have never once made me feel like I am too much or too loud or too chattering. You have made me feel like I am enough. You are more than enough, Yates said. You are everything. Katherine stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I am falling in love with you too, she whispered. I think I have been falling in love with you since the first day we met, when you told me to keep talking and looked at me like I was not a burden but a gift. Yates cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough against her skin, and Katherine held her breath as he lowered his head toward hers. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question being asked and answered. When they finally pulled apart, Katherine was trembling. Oh my, she said breathlessly. That was wonderful. Yates laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was so unexpected and joyful that Katherine started laughing too. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heartbeat. What do we do now? She asked after a while. I live in town. You live up here. I have responsibilities, a job, students depending on me. I cannot just move into your cabin, even though part of me desperately wants to, because it would ruin my reputation and probably get me fired. And as much as I love you, I also love teaching, and I do not want to have to choose between the two. You do not have to choose, Yates said. We will figure it out, together. And they did figure it out, slowly and carefully. Yates began coming into Wallace more often, no longer comfortable with the isolation he had sought for so long. He would show up at the schoolhouse in the late afternoon to walk Katherine back to town, and the children quickly grew accustomed to the quiet cowboy who waited patiently on the steps. He started doing odd jobs around town, repairs and construction work that made use of his skills, and people slowly began to accept his presence. It was not always easy. There was gossip about Katherine and Yates, whispers about whether their relationship was proper, speculation about what they did during those long afternoons at the cabin. The school board called a meeting to discuss whether Katherine's behavior was setting a bad example for the students. But Mrs. Foster, who had initially been concerned, stood up at that meeting and declared that Katherine Preston was the best teacher Wallace had ever had. And if she chose to spend her free time with Yates Zimmerman, that was her own business. As autumn turned to winter and the first snows dusted the mountains, Yates asked Katherine to marry him. They were sitting by the fire in his cabin, Katherine reading aloud from a book, while Yates whittled a piece of wood into a small horse for one of her students. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw him pull a ring from his pocket. "It was my mother's," Yates said, holding it out to her. "Only thing I kept from my old life. I want you to have it. I want you to marry me and be my wife if you will have me." "Yes," Katherine said without hesitation. "Yes, of course I will marry you, 1,000 times yes. I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else. You are the best man I have ever known, and I love you so much it sometimes feels like my heart will burst from the fullness of it. And I know I am talking too much again, but I cannot help it because I am so happy, happier than I ever thought I could be." They were married in the small church in Wallace on a cold December morning in 1883, with the entire town in attendance. Katherine wore a simple blue dress, and Yates wore his best clothes, though he still looked more comfortable in work clothes than anything fancy. The pastor performed a brief ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed Katherine in front of everyone, a declaration that he was no longer the hermit on the mountain but a man in love with his wife. The question of where they would live was solved in a practical way. They spent weekdays in a small house in Wallace that they rented from Mrs. Foster, close enough to the schoolhouse that Katherine could walk to work, and they spent weekends and school breaks at the cabin. It was an unusual arrangement, but it suited them both. Katherine had her teaching and her involvement in the community, and Yates had his mountains and his peace. Together, they had each other. The first year of their marriage was a period of adjustment and discovery. Katherine learned that Yates was ticklish behind his ears, and that he sang softly to himself when he thought no one was listening. She learned that he was haunted by nightmares sometimes, remnants of whatever had driven him into solitude, and that the only thing that helped was her voice, talking to him in the darkness until he calmed. She learned that he was more patient than any person she had ever met, willing to listen to her endless chatter without ever making her feel like she should be quiet. Yates learned that Katherine could not cook to save her life, but that she tried valiantly anyway, producing meals that were usually edible if not exactly delicious. He learned that she cried at sad stories and laughed at bad jokes, and that she talked in her sleep, conducting entire conversations with people who existed only in her dreams. He learned that she was fiercely protective of her students and would fight tooth and nail for them to have the best education possible. He learned that loving Katherine meant his quiet life would never be quiet again, and he would not have it any other way. In the spring of 1884, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening at the cabin, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush as she paced back and forth in front of the fire. Yates pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "You will be an amazing mother," he said firmly. "Our child will be lucky to have you, and you are not doing this alone. I am here. I will always be here." Katherine cried then, hormones and fear and joy all tangled together, and Yates held her and let her cry and told her everything would be all right. And he was right. Everything was all right. Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy baby boy with Yates's blue eyes and Katherine's tendency to make noise. They named him Thomas, after Yates's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he changed everything. Katherine took a temporary leave from teaching to care for him, and Yates moved them permanently to the cabin during those first few months, wanting to be away from town during the vulnerable early weeks of Thomas's life. Katherine adapted to motherhood with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. She talked to Thomas constantly, narrating her actions as she fed and changed and bathed him, telling him stories and singing songs and describing the world outside the cabin windows. Yates would come in from chopping wood or checking traps to find Katherine deep in one-sided conversation with their infant son, and his heart would fill with a contentment he had never imagined possible. When Thomas was 6 months old, Katherine returned to teaching, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse. The older students adored him and fought over who would get to hold him during lessons, and Katherine managed the impressive feat of teaching while also caring for an infant. It was exhausting and chaotic, and everything Katherine loved. As Thomas grew into a toddler, he proved to be a perfect blend of his parents. He had Katherine's curiosity and sociability, always eager to explore and meet new people, but he also had Yates's tendency toward contentment in quiet moments, perfectly happy to sit with a toy and play silently for long stretches. He learned to talk early, encouraged by Katherine's constant chatter, and by his 2nd birthday, he could hold surprisingly coherent conversations. In 1886, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with less anxiety and more excitement. She knew what to expect now, felt confident in her ability to mother multiple children while maintaining her teaching responsibilities. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1887, and they named her Rose. Where Thomas had been quiet as a baby, Rose was loud, crying with enthusiasm and making her presence known from day one. "She takes after you," Yates said affectionately as Katherine paced the cabin trying to soothe their wailing daughter. "She most certainly does," Katherine agreed, laughing despite her exhaustion. "This child has opinions and is determined we should all know about them immediately." The years rolled on, measured in school years and seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas started school with his mother as his teacher, a situation that could have been awkward but somehow worked. Rose followed a few years later, and the Preston children became fixtures in Wallace, known for being polite but spirited, quiet but confident. Yates never fully returned to being the hermit he had once been, but neither did he become entirely comfortable in large groups. He preferred the edges of social gatherings, the quiet conversations with 1 or 2 people, rather than the chaos of crowds. But for Katherine, for his children, he ventured into town regularly, became a known and respected member of the community, helped with church projects and town improvements. Katherine never stopped talking. If anything, motherhood gave her even more to talk about, more stories to tell, more observations to share. But she learned to value silence more than she once had, learned to appreciate the quiet moments with Yates when words were not necessary, when simply being together was enough. In 1891, when Thomas was 7 and Rose was 4, Katherine gave birth to twin boys, an unexpected surprise that threw their household into cheerful chaos. They named them James and Henry, and from the moment they could interact, they were inseparable, communicating in the mysterious way that twins often do, sometimes not needing words at all. 4 children, Katherine marveled one evening as she and Yates sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sun set. Thomas and Rose were playing by the river under their watchful eyes, and the twins were asleep inside. 4 children and a full schoolhouse and this beautiful life we have built together. Sometimes I can hardly believe it is real. "It is real," Yates said, reaching over to take her hand. "This is our life, the one we chose, the one we built." "I am so glad I took that walk up the trail," Katherine said softly. "I am so glad I found your cabin and talked your ear off that first day. I am so glad you told me to keep talking." "I am glad too," Yates said. "You saved me, Katherine. I was disappearing into silence, becoming less and less of a person. You brought me back. You reminded me what it means to be alive." "We saved each other," Katherine said. "I needed someone who would listen without judgment, who would let me be exactly who I am. You gave me that. You gave me everything." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Thomas called out something about a fish he had seen, and Rose shrieked with delight, and from inside the cabin came the sounds of one of the twins waking up. Katherine sighed and stood, ready to tend to whichever baby needed her, but Yates caught her hand. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will never stop loving you." "I love you too," Katherine replied, "now and always." The years continued to unfold in patterns both predictable and surprising. Thomas grew tall like his father and developed his quiet intensity, but he also had his mother's gift for words and became an excellent student. Rose was wild and free, happiest outdoors, constantly asking questions and exploring everything. The twins remained inseparable, developing their own language and way of being in the world that fascinated everyone who met them. Katherine continued teaching until 1895, when the school board finally convinced her that 12 years was long enough and that she deserved to rest. She protested vigorously, arguing that she was only 34 and had plenty of teaching years left in her. But Yates pointed out that she also had 4 children who deserved more of her time and attention. She reluctantly agreed, and her last day as a teacher was marked by a celebration that brought the entire town together. Former students came from as far away as Spokane to thank her for the education and care she had given them. Retirement did not mean Katherine stopped being busy. She threw herself into community work, organizing library fundraisers and church socials and improvement projects for Wallace. She started a women's reading group that met weekly and grew to include nearly every literate woman in town. She volunteered at the new school, helping the teacher who replaced her, offering advice and support without overstepping. And every weekend, without fail, the entire Zimmerman family would pack up and head to the cabin in the mountains. They would spend Saturday and Sunday in the place where it had all begun, the children running wild through the forest while Katherine and Yates sat on the porch and talked, or sometimes just sat in silence, which Katherine had finally learned to appreciate and enjoy. In 1898, tragedy struck when Rose, at 11 years old, fell from a tree and broke her leg badly. The doctor in Wallace did his best, but there were complications, and for several terrifying days, Katherine and Yates feared they might lose their daughter. Katherine talked constantly during those days, chattering away to Rose about anything and everything, keeping her daughter distracted from the pain and fear. Yates sat on Rose's other side, holding her hand, his silent strength a counterpoint to Katherine's verbal energy. Rose recovered, though she walked with a slight limp afterward. She declared that the limp made her interesting and refused to feel sorry for herself, a resilience that made her parents both proud and grateful. Thomas left for university in 1899, heading east to study literature and writing, and his departure left a hole in the family that took time to adjust to. Katherine wrote him long letters every week, filling pages with news from Wallace and observations about his siblings and questions about his studies. Thomas wrote back faithfully, his letters quieter than hers but no less loving, and Katherine saved every single one in a wooden box that Yates had made for her. The turn of the century brought changes to Wallace as well. The town grew larger, more established, less wild. Electricity came to some of the businesses, and there was talk of getting telephone lines. The mountains were no longer quite as remote as they once had been, and the cabin that had once felt like a sanctuary from the world was now an hour's walk from an expanding town. But for Katherine and Yates, the cabin remained special, a reminder of where they had found each other and fallen in love. They kept it maintained and visited regularly, even as their children grew older and began to establish lives of their own. Rose, despite her injury, became a skilled horsewoman and shocked everyone by announcing at age 16 that she intended to work at one of the local ranches. Katherine worried about her daughter doing such physical labor, but Yates supported Rose's decision, recognizing in her the same need for independence and capability that had driven him to the mountains years before. The twins, James and Henry, graduated from the Wallace School in 1904 and surprised no one by deciding to go into business together, opening a general store that competed with but did not quite replace the Foster establishment. They were clever and hardworking, and their business thrived. Thomas returned to Wallace in 1905 with a degree and a wife, a quiet woman named Margaret who worked as a librarian and who fell in love with the town immediately. They built a house on the edge of Wallace, and within a year, Katherine and Yates became grandparents when Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Clara. Katherine was in her element as a grandmother, spoiling Clara shamelessly and filling the child's head with stories and songs and endless chatter. Yates watched his wife with their granddaughter and felt his heart swell with love and gratitude. This life they had built, this family they had created, was more than he had ever dreamed possible during those lonely years in the cabin. In 1908, Rose announced she was engaged to a ranch hand named William, and the wedding that followed was the social event of the season in Wallace. The entire town turned out to see the wild Zimmerman girl marry her cowboy, and Katherine cried through the entire ceremony, tears of joy and nostalgia, and bittersweet awareness that her children were now truly adults. The twins married within months of each other in 1909, both to local girls they had courted for years, and suddenly Katherine and Yates's house felt very empty. They adapted to this new phase of life slowly, learning to be just the two of them again after so many years of a full house. "It is strange," Katherine said one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, now just the two of them for the first time in over 20 years. "I remember when it was always just us here, before the children, before everything. It felt so natural then. Now it feels almost lonely even though I have you." "We will fill the silence," Yates said. "Same way we always have, you talking and me listening," Katherine laughed. "I do not talk quite as much as I used to, you know. Age has mellowed me." "You talk the perfect amount," Yates said, pulling her close. "Never change." They settled into the rhythm of their later years with the same grace they had brought to every other phase of their life together. They traveled occasionally, visiting Thomas and his family, checking on Rose at the ranch where she now managed the horse breeding program, having Sunday dinners with the twins and their growing families. But mostly, they stayed in Wallace, in the house that had been home for so long and the cabin that had been their beginning. More grandchildren arrived, a steady parade of babies that Katherine documented in letters and journals, filling pages with their quirks and milestones and adorable moments. Yates built toys for each grandchild, small wooden animals and dolls and wagons, his skilled hands creating treasures that would be passed down through generations. In 1915, as war raged in Europe and the world seemed increasingly complicated and frightening, Katherine and Yates celebrated 32 years of marriage. The entire family gathered at the cabin for the occasion, children and grandchildren filling the small space to overflowing, spilling out onto the porch and the yard. There was food and music and laughter, and at one point, Thomas stood up to give a speech. "My parents," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "are the most unlikely couple I have ever known. My mother who cannot stop talking and my father who barely speaks. And yet, they fit together perfectly. They have built a life based on respect and love, and the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply listen, or simply talk." They have shown all of us what a true partnership looks like, and we are all better for having witnessed it." Katherine cried, of course, and Yates held her hand, and their children and grandchildren cheered. It was a perfect moment, a crystallization of everything they had built together. As they grew older, Yates began to slow down. His joints ached in the cold, and the walk to the cabin became more difficult. Katherine watched him age with a mixture of tenderness and fear, knowing that their time together would eventually end, but unable to imagine a world without him in it. "When I am gone," Yates said one night as they lay in bed, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness, "I want you to keep talking. Promise me you will not fall into silence just because I am not there to listen." "Do not talk about being gone," Katherine said, her voice breaking. "I cannot bear to think about it. Promise me," Yates insisted. "The world needs your voice. Your children and grandchildren need your stories. Promise me you will keep filling the silence." "I promise," Katherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I need you to promise me something too. Promise me you will not give up, that you will fight to stay with me as long as possible. I am not ready to say goodbye. I will never be ready." "I promise," Yates said. "I will stay as long as I can." He kept that promise for 5 more years. In 1920, at the age of 62, Yates Zimmerman passed away peacefully in his sleep, Katherine beside him, her hand in his. She woke to find him gone, and for the first time in her life, she was completely, utterly silent. The grief was so overwhelming that she could not speak, could not cry, could only sit and hold his hand and try to comprehend that he was truly gone. Her children came, and her grandchildren, and they held her and cried with her. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire population of Wallace and beyond, a testament to how much Yates had been loved despite his quiet nature. People shared stories of his kindness, his skilled craftsmanship, his steady presence, and his absolute devotion to his wife and family. After the funeral, Katherine disappeared. She walked out of town without telling anyone where she was going, and her children panicked, searching frantically until Thomas realized where she must have gone. He found her at the cabin, sitting on the porch, staring out at the river. "Mama," he said gently, sitting down beside her. "We were worried." "I needed to come here," Katherine said, her voice hoarse from crying. "This is where we met. This is where he told me to keep talking. This is where we fell in love. I needed to be here to feel close to him one more time." "I understand," Thomas said, "but you cannot stay here alone, Mama. Come home. Let us take care of you." "Your father made me promise," Katherine said, looking at her son with red-rimmed eyes. "He made me promise I would keep talking, that I would not fall into silence." "But Thomas, I do not know how to talk when the only person who truly listened is gone." "We listen," Thomas said firmly. "Rose listens. James and Henry listen. Your grandchildren listen. You taught all of us how to listen by loving a man who needed to be heard as much as you needed to speak." "We are our parents' children, Mama. We know how to listen." Katherine started to cry again, and Thomas held her, and eventually he walked her back to town. Over the following weeks and months, Katherine slowly began to talk again. At first, it was just small things, comments about the weather or questions about the grandchildren. But gradually her voice returned, her stories came back, and while the grief never fully left her, she learned to live with it. She kept her promise to Yates. She kept talking. She wrote her memoirs, filling notebooks with the story of her life and her love. She told her grandchildren about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive with her words. She attended church socials and town meetings and family dinners, and she talked, always talked, because talking was her way of loving and connecting and being in the world. In 1925, on what would have been their 42nd wedding anniversary, Katherine walked up to the cabin one last time. She was 64 years old, and the walk was harder than it had been, but she made it. She sat on the porch and talked to Yates as though he could hear her, telling him about Thomas's children who were in college now, about Rose's ranch that had become one of the most successful in Idaho, about the twins whose business had expanded to 3 locations, about all the great-grandchildren he had never gotten to meet. "I miss you," she said to the empty air. "Every single day I miss you, but I am still here, still talking, still filling the silence just like you asked. I hope wherever you are, you can hear me. I hope you know that you were the greatest love of my life, and that I will carry you in my heart until the day I die." She sat there until the sun began to set, then made the long walk back to town, knowing it would likely be the last time she made that journey. Her body was growing older, weaker, and she needed to accept her limitations, but her voice remained strong. For 10 more years, Katherine Preston Zimmerman was a fixture in Wallace, the chatty older woman who everyone knew and most people loved. She was there for births and weddings and funerals. She babysat great-grandchildren and told them stories about the Wild West when it was truly wild, about cowboys and miners, and the hard work of building a life in the mountains. She talked and talked and talked, and people listened, because her stories were good and her heart was kind and her love for her lost husband shone through every word. Katherine passed away in her sleep in 1935 at the age of 74, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had gathered when they sensed the end was near. Her last words, whispered to Rose who sat beside her bed, were, "Tell your father I kept my promise. Tell him I never stopped talking." They buried her next to Yates in the Wallace Cemetery, and on her headstone, Thomas had inscribed the words that had defined her relationship with his father. She talked, he listened, and together they found love. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations, a reminder of where it all began. Thomas's children brought their children there, and those children brought their children, and the story of Katherine and Yates became family legend. The chatty woman from Boston who could not stop talking, and the silent cowboy who had been alone for years, who found each other on a mountain trail and fell in love because she needed someone to listen, and he needed someone to talk. Their great-great-grandchildren would visit the cabin decades later and imagine them there, Katherine chattering away while Yates smiled and listened. They would sit on the porch that had been rebuilt many times but still stood in the same spot, and they would understand that the greatest love stories are not about 2 people who are exactly alike, but about 2 people who complete each other, who fill in the empty spaces and make each other whole. Katherine had needed someone who would let her be exactly who she was, someone who would not try to silence her or make her smaller. Yates had needed someone who would bring him back to life, who would remind him that connection and community and love were worth the risk of being hurt. Together, they had built something beautiful, something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. And in the end, that was all anyone could hope for, to be loved completely, to love completely in return, to leave behind a legacy not of wealth or fame but of family and stories, and the knowledge that their love had mattered, had changed lives, had created ripples that would spread out through generations. Katherine Preston had talked too much. Yates Zimmerman had been silent for years. And when they found each other on a mountain trail in Idaho in 1883, they discovered that sometimes the most perfect love is the one that seems the most unlikely, the one that brings together 2 opposites and creates something greater than either could have been alone. Their story ended not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well loved, and a family well raised. It ended with children who knew how to both speak and listen, who understood that communication is the foundation of all love, and who carried forward the legacy their parents had created. It ended as all good stories do, with the certainty that what Katherine and Yates had built together would continue long after they were gone, that their love would echo through time, and that somewhere in the mountains of Idaho, on a trail that still winds beside a river, their spirits remained, talking and listening, listening and talking, forever and always together.